we've all gotten folks being like, I saw this on TikTok and I think I have ADHD because of this. A lot of my clients know my take on social media and Insta therapy, as I call it.
Insta therapy. Welcome to Sleeping Around, where we offer a peek behind the curtain of modern sex and relationship therapy and research, bringing you insights and conversations otherwise reserved for the therapy room. I'm your host, Elena Joy, a Master's of Counseling Psychology student, content creator, and lifelong sex and relationship nerd. Enjoy the episode. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Sleeping Around. Today's conversation is all about therapy. What does it mean to be a trauma-informed, anti-oppressive, sex-positive therapist? And what does it mean to be a client seeking this type of therapy? Our guest today is Gabriel Ray-Contreras. He is a Dominican Lebanese immigrant, gay, and a former medical doctor turned counselor, educator, and podcaster. Together with his partner, he founded and runs In Good Company Counseling, a group private practice dedicated to affirming and inclusive practices. And here comes Julio. Hello. He is also a co-host of the podcast Therapy After Hours, where he discusses mental health and social justice with the desire to increase accessibility to nuanced information. And I think our conversation does the same. We really dive into what it actually means to bring the big 8 isms, as Gabriel says, into therapy and what that looks like on the counselor side and the client side. What are ways to process trauma as safely as possible? How can we find a therapist that aligns? Enjoy the episode. Tell us a little bit about you. Tell us a little bit about your work.
So I've been in the field for 6 years or so, practicing mostly in private practice, working majority of the time with men or folks who identify as men. Within that, queer men as a majority in population, but open to working with anybody and everybody that is trying to explore sex and sexuality, relationships, and kind of their own world, inner world around their sexuality as well. And goes beyond a little bit of the more common cold of mental health, Working with folks who are wanting to dive into some of these topics, or especially even we talk about depression and anxiety and stress and work-life balance as a more general thing in counseling. And I also like to focus that on how is this impacting your sex life? How is this impacting your relationships? How is this impacting your day-to-day differently from just the spoken parts of it of I can't get out of bed, or I can't seem to do my job, or I can't seem to kind of get going, or it's debilitating or over-functioning. Well, yeah, all of that is part of it. And then we've lost that idea of where is this coming into my interpersonal relationships and my sexuality?
Well, and that's one of the reasons that I wanted to have you on the show, is because I'm obviously interested in counseling generally, but personally and specifically, I'm interested in the queer community. I'm interested in work around sex and sexuality, the identity piece, the relational piece, kind of everything that you just named. You also specifically name that you work from an anti-oppressive, trauma-informed, for those listening at home doing air quotes. Exactly, yeah. Trauma-informed. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what that actually means?
Well, for me at least, there's multiple definitions of this, but the way I bring it and kind of use that or work with being anti-oppressive or try to partake in that realm of counseling, it's about how we incorporate the world that we're actually in. So a lot of the times we see counseling as this bubble space of this is my safe space and I can talk about anything and everything. Yes. And the reality of our lives is not in the counseling space. It's outside of it. And so we have to bring in some of those systems, or most of those systems, into the room of how is capitalism impacting me? How is gender expectations or gender culture impacting me? How is patriarchy impacting me? One of my professors in my program talked about the big 8, and it was around gender, sexual orientation, body size, socioeconomic status, religion, ableism and disability, and like all these isms that we hear about, you know, racism, homophobia, and all these different aspects of it, and transphobia that we don't necessarily always talk about, or some therapists don't necessarily bring into the room. But we have to, because we don't live in that bubble of counseling. We live in the real world where all of this is impacting us. Majority of my clients are men, as I've said, you know, and we talk about the patriarchy and we talk about male privilege and in all these ways of how it impacts the population, or how it impacts women, or how it impacts non-binary folks, and impacts everybody in the playing field. And a lot of the times I find that it gets lost of like, how does this impact men that, yes, are getting male privilege in their life, and also how is it impacting them negatively? Because the patriarchy impacts men as well as it impacts other folks, right? And so we have to bring in all of that into the room, because otherwise we're doing half the work, I find. A lot of people are working from this anti-oppressive lens, and also we still run into folks, not just in the counseling field in general, where we don't dive into that. And then in terms of trauma-informed, is like, okay, when we talk about traumatic experiences, some folks, particularly I find clients have come to me like, well, I don't know if I can talk about the details of it. I was like, well, part of it is that we don't need to talk about the details of your traumatic experience to process. And so trauma-informed is a way of like, how do we make sure that we can process all of this and we can do this work without harming our clients more? So it's all about client safety, all about do no harm in this field. And so making sure that we're bringing all of that into the room of like, okay, how do I show up for this person authentically while also mitigating or not causing harm? And if we do cause harm, whether minimal or like a lot, if it's a lot, I think there's a whole different conversation to have. And so we have to be also humble enough and aware enough to be like, oh, I fucked up here. I said something or I did something that was harmful to my client or hurtful. And some clients are able to bring that in and be like, hey, like this wasn't okay for me, or this hurt, that in whatever tone or situation it is. And some are not. And so it's also part of our job as therapists to be like, oh, I noticed this change in body language, in voice level, in tone, inflections. What just happened? And also being aware of our own stuff, even when we don't notice those pieces in session. I remember one time I said something to a client. It kind of felt weird to me, but then we just kind of kept going in the session. And then after the session, I just kept thinking about it. And I was like, if I had been on the other side of this statement, how would I have felt? What would have come up for me? And then I realized that there was something off about my statement, and that it could easily be hurtful or interpreted as hurtful. And I reached out to my client like, hey, so-and-so, I just wanted to reach out because I think I said something, or when I said this might have, I don't know, not landed well. And I just want to open the conversation with you for next session, or for you to know that I'm thinking about this. And so trauma-informed encompasses all of these aspects of it.
What you're describing sounds like trauma-informed means the client knows what's happening, why it's happening. The client knows where you're at as the therapist, and the client gets to decide what happens next. I'm imagining somebody listening to this who's going, oh, I had a therapist, and when I spoke about my trauma, they really pushed me to speak about it in more detail. And that had a negative impact. Maybe now this person feels uncomfortable with the idea of therapy, or thinks therapy's not for them. How does somebody who's maybe looking for a new therapist, or is listening to this and going, that sounds like therapy, that might be more helpful to me, what are some things that somebody could ask maybe of their new therapist, or some things to look out for in terms of finding somebody who's going to work in this way?
I'd say like asking your therapist in a consultation or in an email, how do you work with trauma? You know, there are nonverbal processing theories and techniques that we can use. Things like EMDR, things like lifespan integration, for example, that you don't need to talk about the details of most of it or go into details of your traumatic experience, whatever that looks like. where you can still process, you can still do the work. So many other aspects of it that we can address through those techniques or interventions. Because at the end of the day, like, we're all wired so differently and our experience of life has been so different. Some people get a little bit more affected by it than others. It could be the same household, it could be siblings with the same parents. Just because we're able to process something doesn't mean that we don't struggle with it still. We just struggle with it differently.
My audience is largely made up of queer folks, and many of the questions that I get are around identity exploration. And how to know if I am X, Y, or Z. I think I might be this identity. How can I tell?
Yeah.
What are some ways that you work with that? What are some ways that folks at home can explore?
In terms of in the counseling room, like, part of it is like, where do clients want to go? In that regard of like, do they need a label? Do they want a label? Or in recognizing, okay, like, this is my identity, period. And then part of what I also try to do with them is like, okay, like, if you feel more like this today, are you wanting something to be like rigid and steady and like not changing at all? Or are you open to this idea that who we are and how we show up and our gender kind of can exist in a spectrum where we explore that consistently and continuously of like, oh, it's kind of moving towards this versus kind of moving towards that. And finding those terms that allow that. Gender fluid, for example, where it's labeled enough, but it's not in a box. And that's one option, right? Like, that's one way of doing it. But there are folks who prefer to have one more specific identity or label. And so we explore that and we see, okay, like, you know, in some of my trainings that I've done around gender identity with trans folks or non-binary folks or folks who are in the gender fluid spectrum as trainers, I'm very much someone that will say, like, if you're going to do a training in gender identity, make sure that it's someone who doesn't fit the mold of the day-to-day social patriarchy life that we've built. You know, one of the things that I've heard in multiple trainings and kind of is that even recommending, you know, use they, them pronouns for a while and see how it feels, see how it lands. And then go into like he, him pronouns and see how that lands and how that feels for you. And then go to she, her pronouns and all these different ways of using pronouns to see what feels good. Because some people are like, okay, this is it. Others are like, I need some time to figure this out. But there's this added pressure from society, but also from the community. I find that it's a small pocket that does that.
So you're saying looking for kind of language that is expansive. It's maybe about finding language that allows for exploration and fluidity, and then trying different things on, seeing what feels good. I wonder about your experience working with the internalized pieces, right? So we hear the term internalized homophobia, internalized transphobia, and we have a sense of what it means, but what does it actually look like?
It can show up so many different ways. The shame piece comes up. Shame is something that we've all experienced at some point in our lives or still experience today. It comes and goes a lot of the time, and sometimes it's very static and just stays there with us, and it's like, oh, fuck you. You know, when you talk about like internalized homophobia or internal transphobia, in my experience in this work and in this field, a lot of that comes from conditioning culturally, and culturally it's not just like where you're from. No. Culturally means family dynamics, upbringing culture, societal culture in terms of where you grew up, whether it's a small town, whether it's a big city, whether it's in Canada or outside of Canada. All of these aspects of it are cultural pieces. And that also is part of the anti-oppressive work, is bringing the cultural pieces into the room of like, oh, I think this, but my system is conditioned and it's ingrained in me that this is not okay. One example that I've seen quite a bit in my practice is when I'm working with queer men and there's this sexual shame. There's shame around having sex with other men, for example. Intellectually and logically and cognitively, they're like, oh, but this is fine. Like, it's sex with a man. that I enjoy, that it's pleasurable. And then post not clarity, to be more colloquial here, post not clarity hits, and they're like, oh, fuck. Sex is dirty. Gay sex is dirty or prohibited or not okay, or you're going to die and, go to hell, sinful, whatever it is. I see it often in folks who grew up conservatively more than anything. Not necessarily religious, but just conservatively per se. Religion comes into play a lot there, obviously. And it's like, okay, how do we unlearn some of this that is so ingrained in our system and then connect mind and beliefs, like cognitively in our belief system? Because we logistically know that it's okay, but internally it's like, oh, this is not okay.
Everything that you're saying is really, it lands. There's like I have a visceral kind of a felt sense of what it is that you're describing. And so I imagine that a lot of folks listening do as well. That feeling of mentally, I know, intellectually, I believe that I am whole, I am allowed to experience pleasure, and yet there's a feeling your body doesn't believe the same thing. So how do you reconnect them? How do we unlearn this conditioning?
First of all, recognize like, okay, I can acknowledge that this comes from X, Y, or Z. Talking about sex more consistently with someone that you feel safe and comfortable about the beauty of it, the excitement of sex, the connectiveness of sex, and the pleasure of it all. Sex is about pleasure. Whereas some of us who grew up religious, like I grew up Catholic, have always heard like sex is for procreation. Was like, well, that's very heteronormative and homophobic and all these different things that are like, fuck you, no. This is not just for queer folks. Like straight couples also experience this shame when they want to have sex for pleasure and not have any more kids. And there's this shame that comes to everybody for these experiences. I guess in more kind of clinical terms, it's like distress tolerance, right? Building that distress that we go into in those experiences. Talking about it, shame is, in Brené Brown's words, is friends with isolation. And I talked about clients, conditioning is about consistency and repetitiveness and awareness. And so we have to go the opposite direction and add the things to our lives that we want. So here's the, I think, key part here is we're trying to add the things that we want, not trying to take away the things that we don't want or subtract.
Oh, okay.
When we try to subtract or take away the things that we don't want in that regard in particular, we're focusing on it so much that it just becomes, it's like the pink elephant. Don't think about the pink elephant in the room. It's like, that's all you can think about. And so when we focus on that, we just build on it. Whereas if we're adding the things that we want into our lives, it takes up the space for the things that we don't want. And so it just starts kind of shifting to the side almost.
That's interesting to think of. First of all, when you think about conditioning and unlearning, just kind of the acknowledgement that like, whether it's societal or within your family system or within the town you grew up in or whatever it is, up until this point in your life, like for me, I was 28, 29 when I realized I was gay, like late comparatively, recognizing that I spent 28 years being conditioned one way and learning one way. I can't expect all of that to disappear and to have a completely new understanding, outlook, to have my nervous system, my body overnight flip a switch, when it's been one way. It's not about then removing the old conditioning or getting rid of the past. It's more about adding in and practicing, creating distress tolerance, talking about the things that you do want and the things that you do believe, and that in time that will take over.
When I talk about distress tolerance, it's like, where do we learn? Where do we grow? Is it in our comfort zone or outside of it? Definitely not in it. It's outside of it. So we have to push beyond that. And that becomes uncomfortable. And so, and it's this thing about recognizing the differences between uncomfortable and emotionally unsafe. Those are two different things. And I think society, like Instagram, social media wise, like TikTok, I think those two have been so overlapped on one another people don't want to be uncomfortable a lot of the times. It's like, well, we
Yes.
have to. Whether you start doing that in the counseling room only, fine. And that's how we build the distress tolerance and how we build starting to get more comfortable with some of the things that are unknown and some of the things that are like, what do I do with this? There are a lot of really educated, certified professionals out there that are putting out really amazing information about mental health, about boundaries, about ADHD or neurodivergence, about sexuality, and all of these different themes and topics that we all would like to learn more that we don't get in schools, we don't get at home half the time. And I think that is amazing because it also provides accessibility to information, which is part of why my friend and colleague and I started our podcast. It's like, how do we put this information out there for folks who can't afford therapy right now or who are going to therapy, are going to therapy and are unsure if what they're doing is actually helpful or working for them. And also for therapists to be like, oh, I can work differently than what the system told me.
For any of you who are interested, his podcast is called Therapy After Hours. It'll be linked in the description. It'll be linked in the show notes. Go check it out.
The other side of that coin, I guess, is that we have folks who have no experience, no credentials, not enough background to support it about the things that they're saying. And they're also making blank statements of like, oh, if you do A, B, C, D, then you have ADHD. And it's like, well, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. It's not as black and white. It's not that like I can get a diagnosis from TikTok. And as therapists, I'll say like, we've all gotten folks being like, I saw this on TikTok and I think I have ADHD because of this. And then obviously a lot of my clients know my take on social media and Insta therapy as I call it.
Insta therapy. That's good.
They're usually they come in and like, I saw this on TikTok and I'm not really sure what to believe. Can we talk about this? I'm like, yes, absolutely. Let's talk about it.
Please.
Right? And so it's finding out what makes sense, what works, but also who's giving you that information.
When you're speaking about the difference between being uncomfortable in a way that's going to encourage growth versus being emotionally unsafe.
Yeah.
How do you find that line? And is there a relationship with the kind of popularization of the idea of triggers or having trauma? And I'm imagining this showing up in the way that we relate to other people, what you spoke about, the unwillingness to be uncomfortable and kind of this idea that being uncomfortable is like automatically a bad thing and it's automatically some sort of overstep or...
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously every person is different and their nervous system and like their whole system is individual and unique. And so this does not apply to everybody. I think one of the more kind of generalized or kind of ways of saying this is like, if your fight, flight, or freeze response is activated, you're going too far. If your nervous system is just like fucking shot, you're going too far. You're going too fast, too far, right? Dissociation by nature is not terrible, but if you're spending more of your time dissociated, you're going too far. And, dissociation on social media has been vilified also as well. It's like, oh, this is bad. We dissociate in so many ways that people don't realize. There are certain aspects of dissociation that are quite okay. I'm not talking about the diagnosis of dissociational, So I play video games. And for me, that's an escape of the real world and fantasy world and that's a form of dissociation. Like, how do I disconnect and dissociate from the real world? I go and play video games for a couple of hours where I can do whatever the fuck I want. If most of your day-to-day you're dissociated from reality, that's a whole different ballgame. And so it's like recognizing where that fine line is, and that fine line is different for everybody. It's like, how do we maintain this uncomfortable feeling versus going into this unsafe territory? And it's a very individual, maybe not individual, no, unique experience to each person, where you have to determine what that looks like for you. I can't tell you as your therapist. And so we sit with that and start figuring it out. Before all of this is like building, this is trauma-informed. Before you even go anywhere, you have to build containment, safety containments, tools and strategies that can help someone self-regulate and self-soothe, but also just, okay, if it goes too far, what's the plan here? And what does too far mean? Is it too far going into suicidal ideation, or is too far shutting down completely that you can't move out of bed for however many hours? Every individual client is going to be a different approach. I hear people talk about like specific theories that have their protocols, or that this is how you do it in the theory, and It's like, well, if you do that cookie cutter generic approach to every single client, then you're not meeting your clients where they're at. And so it's like, how do I use all of my training, all of my knowledge, all of my experience to cater to my client, not the opposite thing of like, how do I make my client fit me? It's like, doesn't work.
In working with the queer community and working with men, what are some of the most common concerns that you see come up or show up in your therapy room?
It's around relationships. It's around non-monogamy. It's around compulsory monogamy as a conditioning of society. Where that's the experience that most people think that they need to have or be in. This like, oh, but this is how it is. I find one partner, and if it's a relationship that I want to pursue or have for the rest of my life, then this is my forever partner, and that's it. And so a lot of non-monogamy work is very, very present in the queer community, but also outside of it. A lot of folks are wanting to explore non-monogamy or have been exploring non-monogamy for years.
No, we're just starting to hear about it more, or it's like it feels like it's becoming, I'm not going to say mainstream because it's definitely not there.
Mainstream, it's just more open.
Exactly. We're working toward more of an acceptance. It's having its moment finally.
Yeah, and so that's one of the main things that I see come up in my work right now. And then obviously communication and conflict resolution between partners.
Any tips?
It's individual to each relationship and each person. If you're doing couples work and you haven't done individual work, or either ever or concurrently, there might be something missing. Because a lot of that, how we communicate, how we respond and react, comes from our experience growing up, comes from our past relationships, comes from how we saw our caretakers communicate and engage in their relationship. While there is space for that in couples therapy or in relationship therapy, I find, or I believe, that there is not enough space for it. And so in individual work is where you can go into the nitty-gritty of it all. So when we're doing relationship work, my client is not partner A, partner B, or even partner C or D, like if it's however many people. My focus is the relationship. That's my client. Mm-hmm. Right? And so there's so much that goes beyond the relationship that is unique to each person. And so one thing I do, if I'm working with a couple, every once in a while I will be like, I'm thinking we can do individual sessions next time and kind of have a check-in, see where everybody's at, process or go deep into something that's come up in couple session but we haven't had the chance to address. Or I do that after really intense sessions and I leave them to them to choose. Like, this is my recommendation. If you're open to it, see it separately so that we can debrief this session and process it individually, where you have a whole session just for yourself in that regard. If you don't want that, that's totally fine. We can address all of this differently, but this is kind of what I would recommend.
It feels like a lot of the things that you're sharing kind of go against what you are taught in grad school as a therapist, right?
Yeah.
Oh, big smile.
Yeah. And I'm very proud of it.
I remember learning when we would talk about couples work, it was a pretty hard line around doing couples work and then also doing any individual work with the folks from that couple. That was like a hard do not do, which never really landed for me because exactly what you just described. I'm like, but sometimes it might be helpful for the client to have that space with you without their partner present. And it's not about dishonesty. It's not about breaking some sort of therapeutic alliance. It's like...
Two caveats to this. I say to them, like, I prefer, if one person wants to see me individually, I prefer to see both individually so that we can maintain balance and there is no kind of leaning towards one or the other from their perspective or from mine. Obviously, at the end of the day, I tell them it's still your choice. And then obviously I have to make clinical decisions whether it actually makes sense to see them separately before I even recommend this, because I don't necessarily recommend it to all of my couples. And two, in my first session, I say, these two individual sessions are not, like, I'm not your secret keeper. This is not for this. This is for A, B, C, D. At the end of the day, I'm not working with just a relationship. I'm working with two people that choose to be in a relationship. So there's three different quote-unquote entities in the room. Person A, person B, and the relationship. And if I'm working with a throuple or a bigger polycule, then it's all these other aspects of it. And so recognizing all of these pieces is key to actually building a strong therapeutic relationship that allows people to be comfortable and safe to be like, actually, I don't want that. And I'm like, great, then we don't do it. We want to go from point A to point B, and I recommended bridge 33, and you're like, I don't want bridge 33, I want 45. Let's do 45 and figure out how it goes. It is their work. Yes, we are the ones that have some knowledge about the human body, the human brain, the nervous system, and relationships, and da-da-da. But at the end of the day, you're the expert in your own life, not me. Not me, and you're the one living it. I say this to clients all the time, like, it's easy for me to say a lot of these things because I have zero skin in the game. I'm here to support you and help you figure all of this shit out. But at the end of the day, who's living that life? You or me? You. There's always going to be the therapist-client relationship, the whatever that looks like. But we have to try to bridge it as much as possible. And this is where the systems come in again. You know, I have to recognize and acknowledge my privilege in the room. You know, when you introduced me like a medical doctor, counseling therapist, it's like, well, like, I'm in my early 30s, mid 30s. And I have all of this training under my belt, which is a very privileged situation to be in. But not only that, I'm cis male. I'm straight passing until I open my mouth. And so all of that is privilege in this world. All of that is privilege. And when I'm working with, let's say, a relationship of queer women or non-binary folks that have not been necessarily socialized or brought up as male presenting, how many of these folks have been told by men how to think, how to feel, how to breathe, how to look, smile, makes you look better. Oh, God. So many, all of them. And that's part of being anti-oppressive and trauma-informed, in my opinion. Bridging the gap, but also recognizing what my privileges are in the room and how to make sure that those don't get in the way of our work.
When I think about working in an anti-oppressive way, being a client who's experiencing oppression and is in the therapy room, or even just doing their own work outside of the therapy room, whatever it is. We've talked about these sort of the building blocks, right? Like consent and being informed, client-led, bringing the systems into the room, acknowledging your privilege, all of those pieces. The part where I get stuck, both as a client, both as a therapist in training, is, okay, so we bring the systems into the room, we recognize and acknowledge the areas of oppression, the barriers, whatever it is, the impact these things are having from the past into the present, ongoing. Then what? Like, we are unable to change the systems, right? We know this. As an individual, right? Yes, you can find community and there's activism, and there's obviously all of these actions we can take. Yeah. Same as being a therapist. There's advocacy, there's all these things we can do. But two people in the therapy room working through these pieces, where do you go? What can you do? Well, what's the work after you acknowledge all these things? And then you're like, well, shit, there's this, like you said right at the top, Pandora's box. Where do you instill hope? Where do you go? A
lot of thoughts and no clear answer, because I don't think there is an answer to this question. Other than the bullshit cookie cutter response that we might give someone. Here's the thing. The acknowledgement of all of that and recognizing the systems, the privilege, the power dynamics, is to understand what's on the playing field. You know, if you're playing a board game that has all these different aspects of it, all of it needs to be on the table so that you can actually see what is at your disposal, what is not at your disposal, what is against you, what is for you. And with that information, you can make more informed decisions to move through it. A lot of these things, though, in terms of systems, so, you know, back to reality and not board games, a lot of systems is that, I mean, life is a board game, let me tell you. As you said, you know, we can't change them as individuals. We can't do all the things that we wanted to do about it ourselves. And yes, there are activism and groups and things that we can do to move towards that change that can take years and generations. But there's a difference when we're trying to constantly and consistently oppose it and fight it versus accepting and recognizing, like, okay, this is the reality that's here. What can I do within that? What can I do for myself when I accept that this is the system and that is terrible and it's destructive and harmful in all of these ways? Is there space for me to, you know, recognize, okay, this is the situation and accept that that's the case? What can I do for myself here and for my community? So
can you give an example?
This is usually the example I use in session with my clients. I talk about my mom. And my mom has been moving through private sector and public sector back in Dominican for the last 30-something years, 40 years. And when it's been in the public sector, it has been for all different governments. But also, we all know, especially in countries like Dominican Republic, I'd say, how governments, for the most part, all of them are corrupt. And I remember when I was younger, when I had seen my mom go back and forth between private sector and public sector and kind of different types of government and governments that were fucking terrible and governments that were quote unquote okay or whatever. I asked her, like, why do you continue to work for the government and for the public sector when some of the things that, you know, maybe you don't agree with X, Y, or Z, or the corruption side of things, and are you not worried that some people might bring you into the realm of like, oh, this is also a corrupt person because she works in government, period, that's it, done. And if there's one thing, like, obviously I'm very biased here, but one thing I'll say, like, I don't think I've met anyone with more integrity than my mom. And her response was, there are a lot of systems in place, but there's very little change that you can do from the outside of it. From within, even if it's a small change, that's where you can do something. And just be true to who you are and your values and honor that you're doing this for the greater good or for the population that you're working or supporting. We have to accept that there are things that are out of our control and that we can't change, but there are some things that we can change from within.
It's almost like what you're speaking to is that we can recognize that there are these systems in place, but that doesn't mean that we need to give up. The small things matter, whether that's a small thing that is working to oppose or working to change or to fight against the system. But also I hear you saying that the small things that we do for ourselves still matter. If I think about capitalism as an example, right? And maybe the productivity piece of like, we must, our value, our worth as human beings is dependent on our output, right? If I think about that as that capitalism is the system and the thing that I'm struggling with as a client is this like productivity piece. While we can't change capitalism, maybe we can choose to take a nap in the middle of the afternoon.
Yeah, but that has a trickling effect.
Right.
Because if you do take a nap in the middle of the afternoon and you get more rest and feel whatever, you know, rested and well, then you show up in the world differently. You do different things. You connect with people differently. All of these. And so it has a trickling effect. And if anything, at the end of the day, you know, you connect with people differently. Healing in all of its shapes and forms is relational. I stand by that wholeheartedly. Healing is relational. Community is key to this life. We're in this Western individualized culture, particularly in North America. And this is my take as someone who did not grow up in Canada or the States, right? Like I grew up in Dominican Republic, a Latino culture, very collectivist, very much like I meet you and 3 hours later, you're my cousin, come stay at my place situation. But that is very common, no matter the socioeconomic status. That warmth and openness to connect and build community with folks. And so healing is relational. So even that nap that you took will trickle down to how you show up for people and how you connect with people and how you engage in that community. My co-host and I, my friend Robin, we talk about it in our podcast. Like healing is relational. We say it all probably in half of the episodes of the first season, I think.
I feel like that is a good place for us to kind of wrap this up. That at the end of the day, healing is relational, and making those small choices can have an impact.
Absolutely.
This was a great conversation. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Where can people find you if they want more?
Honestly, the podcast Therapy After Hours, we have an Instagram account, we have then Spotify, and then Apple Podcasts. And then in terms of our practices, In Good Company Counseling, the website is ingoodcompanycounseling.ca. I don't have a very large online presence other than the podcast, to be honest.
Thanks for listening. You can also access all of our extended cut episodes with bonus content from every single guest over on Patreon at patreon.com/AlenaJoy. That's patreon.com/ALAYNAJoy. And be sure to follow us on Instagram at SleepingAroundPod for updates, teasers, episode discussions, and more. This episode was produced by Elena Joy and Danae Fender and edited by Corey Mosqueda. See you next time, back here on the couch.